Hey, just a quick heads up that this episode contains some heavy subjects, including discussions of domestic violence, child abuse, and religious trauma. Listener discretion is advised.
So one of the things I say a lot is that fundamentalism is attractive during times of chaos. And it's a lovely aesthetic. So the fundamentalism that we encounter on Instagram today through the tradwife movement isn't really that different than what we called ourselves 20 years ago, the traditional wives, like we saw in the Duggars. The aesthetic back then is more of a back to the land prairie, 20 kids in long dresses. Today, the aesthetic looks like homesteading. If we had had Instagram back then, it would look identical. And trad is short for traditional. So, the same thing. But it's an answer to the chaos. And so after 9/11, especially when the world felt very chaotic and scary, my trajectory of the past 30 to 40 years matches what happened in the wider evangelical movement, which was mainstream Christianity becoming more political and nationalist and fundamentalist over that span of time. So they lead with beautiful ideals and a pretty aesthetic that feels comforting. It seems soothing. It seems like simpler times, and they promise a better life if you follow their formula. So that's very tempting.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Tia Levings, author of A Well-Trained Wife, and I educate on the abuses in Christian fundamentalism.
So I'm so excited for this episode today. You are so good at talking to people who have some background in evangelical fundamentalism, like who know some of the terminology, who might have been part of it. But then you're also really good at introducing some of these concepts to people who did not grow up in this world or even adjacent to this world. So I'm really excited. So the other thing that I see amongst women in particular is an incredible fatigue with trying to juggle everything in contemporary life. And it's not that they don't want the advances of feminism. They still want to have checkbooks, right? They still want to have fundamental human rights, but they're so tired. And so much of it has to do with what our current society expects of women in terms of creating what we understand as a happy family, a happy marriage, a happy world. There's just so much to do in order to do that. And so there's something that says if I just quit my job and lived in this house, and even if I had 8 kids, it would still be more relaxing than what I'm trying to do now. And I don't think that's necessarily true, but it does seem like a nice fantasy.
So that feeling, that fantasy feeling right there is what I want you to kind of lock on to in your belly, because especially if you're listening to this and you're feeling exhausted and it just seems easier, like it would come home, you are playing into the gentle velvet prison of the soft voice that's coaxing you gently into your cage. They made the world so exhausting. They do that on purpose so that in your fatigue, you will just back off, get back in your box, back, and it's a lot easier than fighting an army of women if you can just wear them out, and so they get tired and they go home. Now, the big lie is that it's not going to be less exhausting at home without any rights or freedoms or agency to get out, and especially if you're trapped with an abuser. But that's not what they lead with. They lead with, isn't it lovely to go back home? Wasn't life simpler when you were back home?
Yeah.
And we want a nap. So we're like, sure.
I think that's something that I try to keep in mind when I'm childcare is so exhausting, finding childcare, right? Well, that's on purpose, right? Republican legislators vote to make childcare difficult. There are solutions that we could have. We have examples from other countries. There are so many different systemic ways we could make life easier for women, and we don't because the people in power want a different world.
Yeah, that's very important to remember.
So today we're talking about, in part, what it's really like to be a trad wife, not just the image that is available on social media, and why it's important that we understand the dynamics actually at work here. So I think for people who aren't familiar, can we start by defining what a trad wife is? It's not a new concept. And so I'd love if you can root it historically for us and in your experience.
Yeah. So again, trad wife is just a quick vernacular, a little hashtag, short for traditional life, traditional wife, traditional lifestyle. It's whatever comes back to the way things used to be. And you can go back as far as 1950s, or you can go back to the 1800s. You can go back to the Puritans. It depends on how far the traditional role that you're looking at, but it's based on this complementarianism model, which teaches men and women are different by design and they have assigned roles according to their genitalia. So men are only good at one thing and women are only good at another thing. And so the woman's place in that system is at home, raising children, bearing children, and that is all. And her entire time and energies and ambitions and output will be in support of that joint mission to raise the family. Doesn't really allow for any exceptions or anomalies or individual strengths, progress, growth, research, evidence. All of that's out the door. This is they did it when the founding fathers did it, so therefore it must be the best thing for all of us, and we must go back to that if we want to have what the ideals were that the original Americans had.
Can you also describe what fundamentalism is? Because I think sometimes people align it with
Evangelicism.
evangelical culture. And I think that it's important to make this distinction.
Yeah, so let's talk about the word fundamentalism for a moment. It's fundamentalism at its core is a system of belief where you have a formula that's going to result in a certain outcome. You have a promise. And so you have the fundamentals of the faith or ideology. Fundamentalism can be in anything. You can be fundamentalist about your soul cycle. You can be fundamentalist about your nutrition. Anything can have that rigidity in this step equals process. Christian fundamentalism is just fundamentalism that's applied to Christianity. And then to just confuse things even more, within the Protestant denominations, there's a fundamentalist denomination. And so sometimes Christians will say, well, we're not fundamentalist Christians. And what they're actually saying is we are not of that denomination. Yeah. It doesn't mean that their denomination isn't fundamentalist in nature. It means that there's a word, a semantic, that they're drawing a distinction between.
Yeah.
Fundamentalism infiltrated the mainstream evangelical movement through organizations that taught a biblical formula for holy living, and it applied to all denominations. So while the Baptists became more rigid and formulaic in their approach, the Presbyterians did as well. And it dovetailed with this movement towards Reformed theology. So again, it drills back down to there are rules and you will follow them, and this should be your outcome. This is, it's this big, wider agenda, bigger movement.
Yeah. So can you situate for us, where were you in the early 2000s? Like, what was your situation?
Yeah, I grew up in a Southern Baptist megachurch in Jacksonville, Florida. We were the largest megachurch in the Southeast. We moved there in 1984 when I was 10, and I grew up a mainstream evangelical Christian who knew that my job was to become a Christian wife and mother. My church was becoming more fundamentalist through Bill Gothard's Institute of Basic Life Principles at the same time. And so by the time that I was a young wife at 19, I was married to someone I didn't really know very well, as we were encouraged to do quickly so we would not have sex before marriage. And I needed to quickly learn how to be a wife to a man who was abusive. I was mentored into the IBLP that way, and then we followed this trajectory into a more high control, ever restricting, reformed theology through the next 7 years. I escaped in 2007 after being excommunicated and shunned in a near murder at midnight. So that's kind of like the broad umbrella of my story.
In your memoir, you write that I'd convinced everyone our life was picture perfect. Not even my parents knew the truth. What was the truth that you're talking about there?
Oh my goodness. So at that time that in the scene in the book, my parents lived 2 blocks away. And the truth was my husband was spanking me. The truth was that we lived in high control and abuse. We lived in some of the most rigid fundamentalist expressions that this movement has. They are not niche or weird or fringe or unusual. It's just that survivors are too ashamed to talk about it, or they're too wrecked. If they manage to get out, they're too wrecked to talk about it. I'm the reflection of 10 years of trauma therapy and a deep conviction that I need to tell you the truth of what it's like to live that way because it's coming for our country. Like, I am horrified that the life I ran away from and barely escaped with my life is part of our headlines. And I know I have the capability to tell that story. That's not true for most people. When they're dealing with the truth of what that fundamentalism does and how it grinds you down, those women usually die, or they're depressed, or they're dysfunctioning. They're breeding the new generation of fundamentalists, and they fade into the background without names. Yeah. That's much more common of a result.
In one of your newsletters, you wrote about how one of the primary tasks of the wife in these families is to serve as PR.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To really do an incredible job of selling this lifestyle. Was that a role that fit for you?
Yeah, so I think that I'm a great example of an ambitious, creative, talented woman who's put into a box and she's allowed one justifiable expression. And it's really convenient when you want for yourself what the patriarchy wants for you. That's the sweetest spot. When your gifts and abilities match what they need, you have a little golden time. And so, yeah, I was great at marketing. I was an early adopter of the internet and the tools that it provided. I really believed that our lifestyle was the best way and the right way, and that we should show a beautiful example of a beautiful family. But I also really wanted those things. I wanted my children to have a happy household, and I wanted to emphasize the good and be positive and, not air our dirty laundry by telling our secrets, but showing like how gorgeous my canning jars are. I had beautiful canning jars and beautiful home births and beautiful cloth diapers all lined up on the clothesline. It's just one of my favorite tactile sensory things. And so I was a very good proponent of the aesthetic. That's why I know that if I'd had Instagram in my hands, I'd have been all over it, because I've got those chops, And so a lot of those trad wives, I'm like, you go, girl. Like, you are showing that you have more to yourself than the little box they want to put you in.
Well, and this is like something that I think a lot of people who don't understand the inner workings of how, like, of what it's like to be in one of these marriages, or just like how proselytizing works, they're like, wait a second, these wives are supposed to be so submissive. Why are their husbands letting them have an Instagram account? Mm-hmm. And it's because they're selling the lifestyle. Like you said, it's that little pocket of, you are allowed to do something here that that uses some of your creative skills, that you get like positive feedback, and you are spreading God's word, right? Like that.
Right.
As long as you are also careful, and I've seen this inner fighting amongst influencers about like not being too ambitious, or like keeping humble, or like modesty, and all of those different things. But
that's right.
It's absolutely okay. They're like, yeah, do more. This is great. It's
called lifestyle evangelism. And so it's very intentional. The Duggar girls all have Insta accounts. Like, they're going where the people are to show a better way to live, and they're hoping that you buy it. Evangelism is all about sales and rabid and contagious enthusiasm. And so they show the best of the best. And I really think that there's a part of them that truly believes what they're producing, because I believed, and it was the truth. The things that I was showing actually did happen. I just didn't show the whole truth. I wallpapered over those dents. I didn't tell the truth of what was happening, because I knew the audience wouldn't like that. They wouldn't fall for that. Like, if I had said, my husband corrects me the same way he corrects our children, that would have been a turnoff. People would have someone would have called the police, I like to think. But maybe not, People do talk. They do tell their abuse stories online, and there is that distance of, well, we aren't going to get involved. But they live in lives that are carefully crafted away from any mandatory reporters. And so it really takes a savvy eye to say, I can see beneath your surface. I know that's too good to be true.
So we're going to hear a lot more of your story as we answer questions from listeners. Let's start with a question from Jacqueline that will help us outline what we are and aren't talking about here.
I'd love to hear your thoughts about why the simple trad wife tasks of intentionally preparing food in specific ways, practicing low-waste ways of living, like mending, and living in a more unplugged way seems to still be made fun of by most other people who do not live the traditional script. Don't we all want a chance to slow down and not continue to grind through capitalistic American culture? I think it is a shame that the traditional ways of life are seen as incorrect ways to live in the modern world. Sometimes those traditional roles still work for families, all while maintaining equity between partners.
Okay, so obviously if you mend your clothes or garden or make your own butter, you are not necessarily a trad wife, but trad wives often do a lot of those things. We had another listener write in to say that the more gardening content that they watched on YouTube, the more trad wife content they got served by the algorithm. Like, we recently published a newsletter on Culture Study about like the moody kitchen aesthetic, which is like a certain type of kitchen that then leads you slowly into trad wife content. The algorithm does radical magic there, but I don't know. How do you think about this idea?
Yeah, two words I really latch on there is incorrect. Like it's incorrect to live this way in your modern. It's a criticism I frequently hear, and that don't we all want to slow down? And the overlap of these good things is true. Like that's why the algorithm leads you down, because a couple things are true. If you're a trad wife, then you're going to be a gardener. It doesn't necessarily mean the reverse is true. If you're a gardener, you're not necessarily a trad wife. And there's nothing incorrect with any of these things. That is so important to emphasize. All of these things are things by themselves and their choices. And if you want to be frugal, you want to mend your clothes, you want to mend your socks, you want to use cloth diapers, you want to make your own ingredients. I used to make my own ketchup, like I used to do everything according to the trad life. The difference is that it's a mask in trad life. It's masking an agenda. It's done to an end, versus I'm doing this because I enjoy it, or I'm doing this because I think it's healthier for my family, or my husband and I have equally, the end of that question was about equal partnerships. My husband and I have equally divvied up the responsibilities, and these are what I'm going to do and these are what he's going to do. That is not the same thing that we're talking about in the trad wife movement, where you are being forced into a role because you have a vagina. Just not the same thing, and to this end of women should not be in the workplace and we should have as many children as possible. Their underlying theology in the trad movement is dominionism. They want the Christian worldview to take over the country and then eventually the globe. And so they have to have a few things to do that. They have to have a military at their disposal. They have to have a population that will cooperate. And like I said earlier, the confrontational method isn't going to necessarily put us there, but the attractiveness of this simpler life will do it for a lot of people, because we do want those things. And we just have to learn how to separate them from the wider agenda so that you can mend your socks and can your food without it becoming part of Gilead.
Are there a couple words that are like flags for you if you're watching content that's kind of pretending, or like at least has us on the surface level is not necessarily tradwife content, but that indicates to you that the person behind the account is probably part of this larger movement and is trying to, in some ways, mask who they are in order to, like, this sounds like it's more diabolical than it maybe is. I mean, it actually is kind of diabolical, but
it's pretty diabolical.
But like, I think sometimes people think like it's so simple, like why no one's like trying to trick you. And I'm like, actually, I think that sometimes they are trying to trick you with content that isn't explicitly religious that will eventually lead you in. I mean, there's a reason why like Young Life when I was in high school had like cool music so that then eventually you would get roped into the larger world, right?
Right.
So yeah, any keywords?
Yeah, keywords, but also key looks. So if there's if it's too pretty and there's nothing behind the scenes really showing any true life, because this is not simpler. It is not actually less work to do all this stuff from scratch. It is a grind. It will exhaust you. It is tedious and you're trapped. And when I was making my own ketchup, it was because I couldn't buy a bottle of ketchup, but I could grow a tomato and I could grind it, I could smush it, and I could, strain it and make ketchup and add little rapadura, which was like a natural sugar I was allowed to use, and I could go through all this work for it. So I look for those kinds of signs, like, is there behind the scenes, like, does this look like a real life or does it look like a set? Are there children present, or are they just conveniently off screen? Because when you're quiverful, you're having as many babies as you can, but mommy has a lot of time on her hands by herself to make a lot of content. That's bullshit. The other thing is like the glowing smile. So the cult glaze is another tell for cult involvement. So if she's smiling serenely through the whole thing and she's very performative in her actions and there's a hypnotic effect to the ballet movements of her gardening, big giant tell. She's under mind control, or she's trying to oversell the beauty and simplicity in a way that is lulling my brain. And my critical thinking is starting to come offline.
Yeah. I also think of anything that like references like larger plan.
Prepping.
Yeah. Anything like prepping, like adjacent.
Yes.
Some of that is
Blessed.
more obvious to me.
Blessed.
Oh my God. Okay. So we have another question that's trying to clarify what we are and aren't talking about. This comes from Jen.
How can we talk about trad wives without it devolving into a discussion about stay-at-home moms? Every time I try to talk about trad wives, and specifically how ominous their work is, inevitably someone in the discussion goes, well, my friend loves her life as a stay-at-home mom, and I want to scream, that's not what I'm talking about, because I don't think the trad wives really want us to be able to choose to stay at home, or have, like, family discussions about it. I think they want us to be like obligated or forced to stay at home.
Okay, so before we answer that larger question, which is great and I love it, Jen calls trad wives' work ominous. Why do you think that is? Like, and I think part of this is the political aspect, which you talk a lot about in your work.
Right. I think there is a gut level instinctive awareness that this is being pulled back, like we are being pulled back from our rights and our agency through a backward way of living that we've evolved from. And so when we can pick up on that feeling of manipulation, even if we don't always have language for it. So this is a great question of an example where she can feel something's off and she's trying to convey it, but she doesn't have the verbiage. So a lot of my work is just providing the vocabulary. And this is going to come back down to they're staying at home for an agenda versus staying at home because they like to stay home with their kids.
Yeah.
And the big distinction, like you can talk to on a personal level with somebody, is have they retained their agency? So are they staying home with a checkbook and a door, and they have a say, an equal say in their partnership, or are they staying at home because their rights and resources have slowly narrowed so that there really is only one choice for their life, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and that if they change their mind tomorrow and decided to go to work, would their entire universe crack and crumble, or would that just be a conversation they had with their husband and an adjustment in their family?
Right. Well, and the thing that I think is seldom talked about is that there's also a lot of educational neglect in these situations. So if you've grown up in one of these families, it's not like you can like leave your family, get divorced.
You can't just leave.
And find a job, right? Like I found
Right.
this when I was reporting on the FLDS communities, the women who had left the church and tried to make a life for themselves, they didn't even essentially have a high school education, right? Because especially the women were not allowed to have access to that sort of education because they, like within the church, they knew you give women those tools and they can leave. You prevent them from having those tools and they can't.
Exactly.
God. My friend who is a stay-at-home mom has credit cards. Like that's going to change your experience of being a stay-at-home mom. Fundamentally.
A lot. She's not asking her husband for permission to buy milk. You know, she's not asking for permission to use their one car. If you're asking permission, big, giant red flag, you know, it's no longer a dialogue you're having with your partner. It's a top-down authoritarian model. And that can slip in really easily when he's the one with the breadwinning agency and you're dependent on him. Now you are on equal footing with your children. And there's a lot that changes in that world.
Yeah. And I think that's the part that people, if they aren't actually familiar with this theology, they're just like, oh, this woman just loves her husband and her kids, like, and wants to make lemonade to take out to him on the tractor. Not, I have to ask permission to even get the ingredients to make this lemonade.
Right. Yeah. It's not always nefarious and ominous either. He can mean well. He can be nice. And the authority structure can still be there. I mean, yeah.
That's a really good point. It's not like all of these men are like devils with rods, right? They can be nice, but still reside within that larger authority structure and that understanding.
Yeah, I call it benevolent patriarchy. Benevolent patriarchy is still patriarchy. It's still high control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our next question is from May, and it's about getting into the life and getting out of it.
Growing up in an Amish and conservative Mennonite family, I understand how a trad wife type of lifestyle perpetuates itself when literally everyone you've known since birth is living it and your whole world is built to reinforce it. But how is it sustainable when people come to it later, largely in isolation, or at least physical isolation. Why is it still so hard for people to extract themselves from it?
So we knew this was the perfect question for you because this is basically what your book is about. So what's the sort of short answer here? As in, like, how do people get sucked in later in life?
I think they get sucked in because in our culture, almost no one's coming to this as a blank slate. It's part of our culture. And so the water turns up very slowly. You mean well. In my instance, I turned to a mentor who had a lot of children because I needed help learning how to be a mother in an erratic situation. And so women at church are taught to turn to older women. It's the Titus 2 model. And so that's just a very gentle, easy example of how it just kind of seeped in, and I just kind of swept into this world at the same time as the external atmosphere was becoming this way. So pretty soon, I call it the cult without walls, because even though I wasn't in an Amish community where you can actually physically see the borders and the way everyone lives, I was just as isolated. It's a country within a country. This is an America within an America. And so you are in the world, but not of it. And you don't have any access to anybody who's not like you by the time you're in that deep. And so extrication is, for all the reasons we've already talked about, just as hard. I mean, I don't have, there's nobody to ask. There's no safe path out. There's no world where your husband isn't aware of your movements. There's no education to fall back on. And then begins the very hard work of convincing outsiders that you're really in danger. When, for example, Project 2025 threatens to take away our right of no-fault divorce. So if the system is predicated on you have to convince us that you have a reason to get divorced, you're struck with convincing all that. And while you yourself are still coming to an understanding of what you've just experienced, extrication is really, really hard.
Right. Mm-hmm. You're not only convincing yourself that you need to leave, which is an ongoing process that I am sure is filled with doubt and second thoughts. But then if you also are trying to convince others that you deserve to leave, it's so much.
Right. And then we have J.D. Vance chosen as the VP ticket, and he is quoted as saying that women should stay with their abusive husbands because it's hard on the kids. Well, that leaves out everybody who would be dead if they don't get out, and that's definitely my story. My children were unhappy sometimes that this happened to our family, but it's because abuse broke our family. Abuse broke our family, not divorce. Divorce was the way, it was the path to freedom for me. And that if that's how our country changes, women are going to die. That is the unhappy truth of that ideology. We know that from survivors telling their stories. When we have all of this trad lifestyle has tells, it has outcomes, it has evidence, testimonies, survivors. I'm a big one for the historical timeline of progress. So we're supposed to be growing as a society. That doesn't mean we go backwards to something we tried and it failed and we grew past because there were reasons. We didn't just experimentally decide to give women rights. No, women fought. They went to jail. They lost their lives. They fought hard to get our rights because not having rights wasn't working for them. There were problems with not having rights that we don't really want to return to, but they make it look really pretty.
I know. We are in such a moment of regression, I think. And a lot of it is reactionary. Mm-hmm. I always think of the history of feminism as 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We are in a massive step back right now. But that doesn't mean that we're not, there's still not momentum and the potential for continued progress. Mm-hmm. One thing that I've seen a lot with some influencers and people I know is kind of going deeper down the well. You start out going to a cool church, right? And you're like, I need something even more restrictive because that feels more safe. So then you start going to a more evangelical church, even more. And then one of the influencers I follow left her evangelical church and is now part of an Orthodox church. She covers her head. She basically, it seems, if you're reading between the lines, that she is craving even more control than ever before. And she's actually dragging her husband along with her, which is fascinating. Yes. Convincing her husband to become part of the church and to become the patriarch.
Yes.
Have you seen that similar progression of becoming more and more?
Oh, yeah. It's very common. Also, it's very common for the woman to lead the men into it because she's at home doing the research and she's saying, here's the solution. So I think what happens is there's this ever constant doubt process that this formula didn't work. clearly we need more. We need more structure. We need more
Yeah.
rules. And the patriarchy is always feeding you this diet of more rigid and more rigid. And there's never a point where you've done enough. You've never reached this limit where, oh, we submitted to these ideals and now we have this happy family and we have no problems and nothing bad ever happens to us because we were so obedient. That never happens. So as you face problems and as things happen to you and you face challenge and struggle, you drill down harder and harder and harder. And so when you're in one group and it wasn't quite satisfying, then you become more orthodox in your progression. That's really common. That's how the extreme views manifest, because each author leads to another author, each teaching leads to another, and the movement becomes more restrictive and more restrictive because it's in pursuit of ideological purity. Way back to the original definition of fundamentalism, they are in pursuit of a pure ideology, and they're using this formula in order to achieve it. So you're constantly trying to purify and narrow to get what you want. The promise never delivers. That's the big joke on everybody. There is this does not lead to what they promise. And if we look at the fruit of what they produce, we'll see that we're just so caught up in the process. It's the message is always, well, if it fails, it's something you did. So you must perfect yourself more and do this better. And you were just missing this ingredient, pray more, pray harder, that kind of thing. And so you just keep doing more and more and more because there's never an attainment and there's never enough. High control environments breed more high control practices, not the other way around.
Yeah. Okay, our next question is actually, there's a ton of questions that we received about a specific element of being a trad wife, and that is fundy baby voice.
Yes.
And the first time I saw people talking about this was when Alabama Senator Katie Britt gave the Republican response to President Biden's State of the Union address back in March. So we're going to hear a little clip of that.
Good evening, America. My name is Katie Britt, and I have the honor of serving the people of the great state of Alabama in the United States Senate. However, that's not the job that matters most. I am a proud wife and mom of 2 school-aged kids.
And some people compare her voice to Michelle Duggar's, so we will also hear a clip of that.
So anyway, this is our great room. And Jim, I wanted to design it where it was open to the kitchen area because that's where Mom and the girls spend most of our time cooking and doing all that. So we can be a part of everything that's going on, and it just makes it really nice.
I know this voice. I didn't know it was called fundy baby voice. Like, I just know it from like a certain type of like prayer circle. But where does this voice come from? Can you talk more about it?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, we should say fundy baby voice is an outsider term applied to this phenomenon an attempt to explain it. We did not call it fundy baby voice when we were doing it. We called it sounding childlike, keeping sweet, staying sweet, gentle spirit, being feminine. And again, it's that breathy, almost sexualized child prosody that coaxes you along. And so it is a vocal manipulation to make a woman sound less threatening, changes the sound of her own voice. If you practice that voice long enough, you will no longer sound like your maturity. And it takes work. I've had to go through extensive vocal retraining just to get back to the sound of my own voice after leaving, because you don't just snap in and out like a code switch. When you're groomed to sound that way. As far as where it comes from, that's a little more complicated to tease apart. It's one of those parts of our culture that's so pervasive that it's hard to say one thing. Although I can tell you that there's this dynamic in high control religion, and certainly in the 50s as it became like the 50s housewife and sounding sweet and pleasing and being hyper femme and all of that. In 1963, 2 books came out, The Feminine Mystique and Fascinating Womanhood. Now, Fascinating Womanhood is technically a Mormon book, but it didn't lead with its Mormonism, and people don't always realize that that's its source. It's still in print today, and it teaches women to be ultra feminine and childlike so that they will become an angelic, soft, feminine self. Is a big part of my story because it was handed to me by so many women, and that is how it's passed along from woman to woman. There were fascinating womanhood groups. There are still Facebook groups, and this is where women learn to actually take that on so they can call their husbands big hairy brutes and fight and get basically coax the entire role play, into place. If a woman sounds like a baby, she's not threatening. She's diminutive. and she can get you to do the things that you maybe don't want to do. So it gives her a feeling of empowerment, like getting him to cooperate. One way it's talked about is the man is the head of the house, but the woman is the neck. Well, the vocal training is how she turns his head or his will to her will.
It's so funny because there's this, when I was writing a piece on trad wife influencers last year, like there's this woman who is not Christian forward, and I'm pretty sure that she's playing everything up for the algorithm. I do not think that of the vast majority of these women, but this woman I do. And she was cosplaying as like Marilyn Monroe, and her fundy baby voice was right on that cusp of Marilyn Monroe, which is fascinating because it's like it's like the voice that is associated with the biggest sex symbol of the last 100 years, but also a sex symbol who was incredibly powerful, but was like always understood as innocent.
There's a lot of overlap happening right now in what you just said. So another thing that happens with the baby voice is that women's voices can truncate at the age they were first molested or interfered with. And so sometimes they sound like young children because they were interfered with as young children and they kind of got stuck there vocally. That's not coincidental, because when you want a grown woman to sound like a child, and that grown woman is someone you sleep with and find sexually attractive, those two things are related. He is now finding a childlike adult woman attractive, which breeds more sexual abuse. And sexual abuse is a huge part of the patriarchy. So these aren't things that we can like put in little boxes and say, well, this is this and this is that. Just like you can't where it comes from, the impact is all very much the same. Now, when Katie Britt splashed on the scene and brought it into the mainstream, it stirred up a lot of things, a lot of emotions for people, because it is so tied to their own subjugation, self-subjugation, and their own sexual abuse stories. And this idea of modesty culture where the church repeatedly tells us that that is where women are safe and that is where children are safe, except statistics don't breed that out. Statistics show us that church is one of the most dangerous places a woman or a child can be, because the church doesn't take abuse seriously and because they continually sexualize young children. And the voice is one way, the tell is where it comes out, is that if they want you to sound like a baby, but they're going to have sex with you, the disjointedness, like I lose my words when I think of the horror of that, because that is the mind fuck that we experience in that kind of high control religion.
So this is a good transition into kind of going back to May's question. Like, the whole belief system is designed to keep people in, to keep them bound by secrecy, bound by like this understanding that this is the only way to salvation. Like, that's something that I think sometimes gets lost, is like people think if they leave, then they are damned and their children are damned. Like, how do you get around that? That's really difficult. So what has to fall into place for people to leave?
I think a survival instinct. They're going to make sure that you know you're damned by demonstrating it. So when you leave, you do lose your community. You are going to be condemned. They're going to call you names. They're going to call you heretic and whore and Jezebel. They're going to cut you off from the resources and everything that you had. I was excommunicated and formally shunned. It's part of the experience. And so unless you have a vein inside of yourself that says, I know that's what they're going to do, but that does not actually mean I'm spiritually damned, you might fall for it, because they're going to be very convincing. In my case, and what I think I've witnessed from other survivors, is that something else comes online, and that is your survival instinct that says, your life is hell on earth and I've already experienced it, and I would rather live and protect my children than experience another day of that. And that's where the courage comes in.
So I can't imagine that many trad wives are listening to this podcast, but I do think that there are some people whose loved ones are stuck in some version of this. So what advice would you give them noticing that this is going on? Like, is there anything that people who on the outside can do?
Yeah, I always encourage to keep the lines of communication as open as possible. Try to be non-judgmental in your conversations with them. Make sure that they know that you are someone they can turn to when they want to or need to, because that won't be a predictable thing. Leaving is almost always urgent. There's some sort of urgency attached to it. So it'll be a random. And if you want them to be able to come to you and not feel like they're cut off from that. So I had an entire network of people I was able to turn to, that they all had their sneaking suspicions that I was in over my head and that there were bad things happening at home, but they were open to me, and they They always kind of conveyed that they'd be here for me when I was ready for them. Another way is to slip them non-traceable ways of payment. So someone messaged me the other day and said she buys gift cards at the grocery store and then she leaves them for people who, like if she sees something at the pediatrician's office or the grocery store or something, and she'll just hand out these gift cards because they don't have access to their own finances. One lady made her escape simply because she had a stack of gift cards at her disposal. Like she'd been saving them up. So little ways that you can think of. I get this kick out of my book in that. So I wrote it for the lady that's going to put it in her cart in Target. Like I wrote it for the lady who's not allowed to go into a bookstore or show it on the receipt, but she's going to toss it in her cart with the milk. And people will joke like we should put a new jacket on it that says how to be a well-trained wife so that they're allowed to have it at home.
Yeah.
That kind of a thing. Like how can you slip them?
Even the title itself is ambiguous enough that if you saw, I don't know, if you saw it somehow, the illustration is a little unambiguous, but I think that the title, if you could say that, like just the spine, it would be passable.
Yes, it raises eyebrows, and that's how I knew it was the title for the book.
Okay, our last question is a reflective one, and it comes from Elizabeth.
Many performed identities, like the trad wife, appeal to people because there is a kernel of goodness or truth somewhere in all the mess and harm. I think about this when I reflect on my experience as a former evangelical. When people stop performing that identity, there is a strong instinct to shame and fully reject that part of their experience. What parts, if any, of the trad wife identity and beliefs do you want to take with you? Is there any piece of it that still connects with you or that you grieve?
This is a hard one, I know. It's really good, though.
It's a tender one, and it's one where I get to speak up for younger me, who I love so much because she tried so hard. I'm really grateful that it gave me the years with my children. I had 12 years at home with my kids, and I was subversive during those years, teaching them things that I wanted them to learn. And I have a great relationship with my children today because of those foundational years. It also helps with some of the sting that I gave my youth to pursuit of an ideology instead of self-development and becoming a strong person first. So while it sucked to have to mother while I healed, like it's not fair to my kids that they didn't have a healed parent, it's tender that we got to learn together, and I got to show them that, no, you don't have to stay in abuse, which I think is going to be something they carry with them forever. I loved homeschooling. When homeschooling can be done right, homeschooling is a beautiful relationship, and it's a part of the conversation in a country that doesn't value the safety of its students. I love all of the aesthetic. I loved my birth stories. I love the midwives who took such wonderful care of me. I love canned food. I love gardening. I love walking barefoot in the dirt. I still love hanging my clothes on the line. I don't do it because I'm busy doing things, but I love all of that stuff. And so to be able to reclaim it and say, I loved doing this just because I love doing this, and it doesn't have to feed into any wider agenda. It also has given me a resilience of spirit that helps me, like when my money's tight, I know how to go cook food from ingredients. I don't need convenience foods. That's like a tiny empowerment that I carry with me that my trad life showed me. Like I know how to make good with almost nothing. And I know how to be really thankful for the simple joys in life, because that was the only joy I had in life back then. But now I choose it because it's not excessive or, harmful to the planet or waste, So yeah, I mean, I carry her with me, and I have integrated her into who I am today. And I understand with empathy why people would find all of that attractive. And I support the ability to stay home and the option to stay home. And I support moms in their motherhood. I don't want our country to make it so that everybody has to do the same thing because they have no other options.
This has been such a delight. I'm really like an honor, and I really can't recommend the book highly enough. Where can people find you if they want to know more about you, follow you? I hope you talk about the newsletter.
Yeah, I am kind of everywhere. Tia Leving's writer on the social platforms. I do a lot of educational type content there. I also share my story of how I continue to break down anti-fundamentalist thinking in our politics, headlines, the deconstruction process itself, what it's like to heal from trauma at my Substack, tialevings.substack.com. And my website is tialevings.com. A Well-Trained Wife is available anywhere books are sold in hardcover, digital, or audio, which I read myself, and people always ask that.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, so today's episode is free for everyone. That means you'll get to hear the Ask Aunt Anything, a part of the show that's kind of like a free-for-all and normally just for paid subscribers. We've talked about the best plants for your office, getting through a friend breakup, politely and impolitely shutting down fat-phobic talk. And today's question is a follow-up to a newsletter I wrote back in January called The Right Kind of Busy. Melody, will you read this question for me?
This is from Liza. I loved Anne's recent essay about the right kind of busy and would be excited to hear specific thoughts on how to keep that kind of busy from tipping into things feeling overly hectic and bad, a.k.a. the wrong kind of busy.
Liza, I am currently in the wrong kind of busy.
Same.
But I know why I am. The right kind of busy occurs when you have not overprogrammed yourself so that if something switches in your life, if there's some minor catastrophe, if some work gets put on your plate, that you don't immediately switch over into the wrong kind of busy. And what happened to me is that I was right on the edge. It was like teetering. And then some work that I thought was done got moved and consolidated into a month period of time. This will all become clear next month. But basically, I am doing an additional part-time job on top of all of my other part-time jobs. And so that to me suggests that I had already overestimated what I could bear. So because if one extra thing has really put me into this like burnout spiral, then I was already overcommitted. What are your feelings on this?
Oh, yeah, I'm in the exact same boat. And I think you're spot on. Like, you know, I neglected everything I was doing in June to get through the rest of the Supreme Court term and then thought I would have all of July to catch up. But literally two emails have thrown July into disarray, and I'm now going to be working like every weekend for the foreseeable future.
Right.
And there's just like really no way out of it. So there's just no margin. There's no breathing room.
Yeah.
But I can't quite identify what the like final choice was that got me to that point.
Well, the hard thing for us as freelancers is that there is no predictability. Mm-hmm. And you can try and account for things, and you can try the way both of us are right now to work ahead and get on top of things so that you can actually go on vacation. Mm-hmm. But really what it does is it just like puts you into this incredibly wrong kind of busy ahead of your vacation. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that I've been thinking about is that like both you and I, and a lot of other people that I know who find themselves in this conundrum, have accepted amount of work and responsibilities that if we never went on vacation, if we didn't have any sort of spontaneous friend meetup, if we never got sick, if no one in our lives ever got sick, and we were willing to work probably 6 days a week, like everything would be fine. Total equilibrium, right? We're like, I'm not taking on too much. But the reality is,
if there is that margin, I'm like, yeah, I can take that on because I do have the space and time technically. Yes. But yeah.
Yes. And you have the creative energy to do it, and you have the capacity technically to do it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think especially for those of us who came up working that way or learned to work that way, that level of full still feels like, oh, we've got room to go. I can still accept other things. Mm-hmm. Instead of recognizing that full is actually like about half of where that was before.
Yeah.
And that is a really, really difficult recalibration. And the other thing, like, and so many of us have realized this, is that, yes, I could keep at an even keel if none of those catastrophes happened, if I never took vacation, if I didn't have any room for friends. But that is a life that rotates around your work, not you having anything more than that. And I think that's really at the heart of the problem, is that, like, if we want to have strong connections and don't want to be lonely, if we want to build community, if we want to have rest and if we want to make room in our lives for each other and for our own care, we can't operate at that other level of full. But okay, we're just explaining why we're bad at it.
But no, I think they can learn from our errors. The other thing that's hard for me too, like as a freelancer, is this is the first time in my life that I've ever had any say over how much money I make. And I like making money, and I finally, again, for the first time in my adult life, can like spend money on kind of stupid stuff if I want to. And so I keep taking on more work because I'm like, well, there's more money to be made.
Yep.
But my therapist dragged me recently where she was like, okay, but like at a certain point, like what is that money for? And I was like, to see the world. And she goes, oh, with all the time you don't take off? And I was like, okay, Rebecca.
Right. Yeah. So I think that the advice that I'm trying to take, and I love that this question came in when it did, because I was having a conversation with myself about this week, is that as I look to the future, I have to continue, like every time an offer or a type of work comes in, I have to think like, is this something, like, am I already operating at full levels?
Yeah.
Is this something that future me will feel absolutely overwhelmed by?
Oh, God.
And how do you have an honest conversation with yourself about that? Like, because I'm very good at talking myself into saying yes to things. And I think having people, like, whether it's I send you things or I send like my fellow newsletter writer chat things, like having someone who can real talk me and be like, you don't need that.
Yeah.
You're already doing enough. You're already making enough money. It's fine.
The future you thing is so real. I saw, it was probably on Twitter a long time ago, somebody saying, like, if somebody asks you to do something in the future, imagine they're asking you to do it tomorrow. And if it's not like, absolutely, I would love to do that tomorrow, then you're not going to want to do it in the future.
Yep. Well, and the other thing to emphasize here is that I want to have more space in my life to like offer mentorship and advice. I want to have more space in my life to be a spontaneous friend, to spend more time in my community, like all of those things. I want to be the person who, when someone asks me to do something that is not related to work, that I don't think about future me, that like future me is like, no, you're not going to want to do that. You're going to be too tired. You're going to want to say no, right? Like I want to be able to accept those things, but I can't.
Yeah.
If I'm always saying yes to work things, because those work things offer me a sense of prestige and safety and money.
Okay, so how do we get ourselves out of our current situation?
Well, I do think that having someone else who can offer you perspective on these things is really useful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that like having seasons of no is also useful. I really practice this at various points, like when I'm heads down on the book and that sort of thing. Like, okay, everything that comes in, money or not, I have to be like, I overscheduled myself and I'm now trying to compensate by declining a bunch of things.
Yeah. You know, Leah Littman, one of the hosts of Strict Scrutiny, is working on a book, and she has an autoresponder on her email saying she's going to be slow to respond because she's working on her book, and she's also not accepting any new projects during this time, but thanks for asking.
Yeah.
And then she doesn't have to like respond individually to everything that comes in.
That's smart. I also think, and this person is not asking about writing a book, but I think books are part of the problem, and none of us should be writing books. Because books don't pay enough for you to actually focus on the book. So what you do is you do the book on top of your other things. So unless you're writing a romance novel in your spare creative time like Melody, you should.
No, but I don't have any spare creative time is the point. I've written one page in like 3 years. I just want time to pull the weeds in my garden. I've done that one time this summer.
Well, and that's the thing. If someone looked at my life and they were like, you're doing too many things, like you shouldn't be running a micro dahlia farm. I'm like, no, that's the best part. I'm not giving that up. I need to give up the other things.
Yeah.
All right. I think we answered that one. I think that was good.
We mused. We do offer musings, not always advice.
Thanks so much for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise that you don't want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod, or check the show notes for a link. Today's episode is free for everyone, so if you like what you hear and you want to support the show and make it sustainable, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. And if you're already a Culture Study newsletter subscriber, you get 35% off. Just look in your email for a Culture Study promo code, and you will figure out how to get that off. All right, for this episode, this is a doozy. We have a lot to talk about here. But I think what I'd be most interested in hearing is how hearing from someone who had been inside and their reflections on the experience, how that has affected, textured, maybe changed or not changed your previous thinking on trad wives in general. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.